Hi, my name is Kumo Maseche. I am a licensed therapist, a coach, a consultant, and the owner of KM Healing. Welcome to my channel. If this is your first time here, thank you so much for being here. If you are returning, also thank you so much for returning. On this channel, I talk about all things mental health, sex education, and anything in between that feels relevant. I hope you choose to stick around. So today I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the reasons we struggle with sharing things with our therapist when we are in session. I've had this come up a lot with my own clients in the past, and it's always a moment of contention, right? It happens at all points of the therapy relationship, whether it's at the beginning when you're first meeting the person, in the middle, or even just towards the end, right? When you're kind of feeling like maybe it's time for me to end therapy, right? There are lots of different reasons it might feel really uncomfortable to share something with your therapist. And so I wanted today to be a little bit about some of the reasons that it might be hard to share something with your therapist, and hopefully it gives you a little bit of clarity or comfort. Yeah, that's a better word. So the first reason you might struggle to share something with your therapist. So a lot of the time at the very beginning of therapy, people are really panicked about the things that they do or don't share, maybe about the things that come up in the therapist's intake that they maybe don't feel comfortable sharing. And then it kind of makes us kind of panic about whether or not you should be sharing this, right? Because this is therapy, right? You're supposed to share everything with your therapist. And I'm here to tell you that this is normal. You do not, at any point in the therapeutic relationship, have to share everything with your therapist. But especially at the beginning, the goal of therapy at the very beginning is for you and the therapist to build a sense of rapport, a sense of trust. It's kind of like getting to know one another. Think about if you are getting to know any person on a regular basis, you wouldn't just spew out everything about your history, about your life, about your thoughts at the very beginning of meeting them. And therapy is the same. Just because this is a space that over time is meant to be one that is safe enough for you to share anything that you want to share, does not mean that at the very beginning of it, if you don't feel comfortable enough, there's something wrong. So give yourself a little bit of grace in that it takes time to build rapport. And we, as the therapists, are trying to be mindful of what that means for you. We're a complete stranger to you at the very beginning. And so be kind to yourself, and also, hold space for the fact that this is a time that is supposed to take a while. Number 2, you just aren't ready to talk about it yet. Now, even if you have been with this therapist for years on end, and suddenly something comes up, maybe it's something that recently happened or something that you just remembered, sometimes it's just your body telling you that it's not ready to come out. Maybe it's something you haven't shared with anyone. Maybe it's something new to you as well. Maybe you are trying to take time to process it by yourself, right? Sometimes our gut is telling us that we are not ready to have this thing come out. And as a somatic therapist myself, I will always encourage my clients to be mindful of what their body is telling them. Just because therapy is a space where you are able to share anything and everything does not mean that I, as your therapist, am entitled to all of that information. So if you still need time, if there are things that you even just don't want to share at all with your therapist, that's also okay. It might just not be the time. It might still need a little bit of time. I am someone who will ask questions around it, but I will never push a person to share it. In this instance, it's okay. If your body is telling you you're not ready to talk about it, it's okay to not be ready. Give yourself time if time is what you need. Number 3, maybe they aren't a good fit. This one is difficult. Now, fit doesn't have anything to do with how good, quote unquote, the therapist is or how bad the therapist is. Therapists, just like human beings on a day-to-day basis, are different kinds of people. It can range from anything like the techniques that the therapist uses to the personality of the therapist. You might have reached out to a therapist because you wanted to try a certain kind of therapy. For instance, maybe like me, somatic therapy, right? The type of therapy that I do works a lot with the body. It's about how our experiences, our traumas, the ways that our body and our nervous system gives us information about our history. And that might be something that you were really interested in and wanted to talk to me about, or talk with somebody who's experienced in that form of therapy. But what might happen is you get into the space and my personality just doesn't gel with you, right? Maybe I don't challenge you enough, or maybe I joke a lot in ways that maybe are not really comfortable for you. Some people really like therapists who are lighthearted and are able to kind of flow between seriousness and playfulness. And some people might not gel with that. So we want to be mindful of fit. And fit, like I'm saying, is not always just about the type of therapy. It can also just be about personality. Just like anyone else in your life, therapists are different kinds of people. And so even if the technique that someone uses works for you, or the type of therapy has worked for you in the past, maybe that particular person and the way that they express that technique, the way that they engage in the technique with you doesn't work. And that's okay. The last one, they remind you of someone or something that you haven't felt safe or comfortable with in the past. So what does this mean? We want to think about things like, if it's a person, it could be a relationship that you have. If you have a difficult relationship with a parent, with a grandparent, with a friend, with a sibling, with a teacher in your past, with an elder in your community, right? If your therapist encompasses maybe some of the traits of that person, or even might speak like that person or use some of the same wording or phrases, it can sometimes trigger us, right? In therapy, we call this transference. This is the act of your body feeling as though this person or this space, you're reacting to this person as if they are someone else or something else. This is not a good or a bad thing, it's just information, especially for therapists, right? If the therapist encompasses some of the traits or embodiments of that person, it can be really important for you to talk to them about it. Share what it is that they remind you of about that person, if it's something that feels accessible to you or something that you notice for yourself. Oftentimes, a therapist will notice as well. Right? They might notice a shift in your posture, or a shift in how you're speaking to them, or the ways that the things that you're sharing might come up differently than they have in the past. So sometimes it can be that a certain relationship comes up and that starts to kind of come out in the space with the therapist. This is really helpful for the work. It can be really important if you notice that maybe you don't want to share something with the therapist, particularly because there are certain traits that they have that remind you of a person that you've had a hard relationship with in the past. It can be really important to share it with them so that you can process it together. On the other hand, a different kind of relationship that might lend to safety or comfort and might make it hard for you to share something with a therapist could be that they remind you of a specific system. So what do I mean by this, right? So growing up in a white-centric, heterosexist, able-bodied society, and being a person of color, being a queer person, being a person with disabilities, right, or any other kind of marginalized identity, you're of course going to experience some sense of discomfort, or maybe even a lack of safety, especially if you felt personally victimized by these systems. And sometimes even if you haven't been personally victimized, just the way that we exist in our society as people with marginalized identities can make it really difficult for us to show up, especially in therapy, and be vulnerable, especially if your therapist encompasses some or one or all of these identities. Now, a disclaimer I have, if you are, let's say, a person of color and you have a white therapist, this does not by any means mean that that person cannot do the work with you. We want to be mindful of creating this blanket idea that only Black therapists can treat Black clients or only queer therapists can treat queer clients. However, something that we want to be mindful of in doing this work is whether or not the therapist has acknowledged or engaged with the ways that their privilege might affect the work that you do with them. So for my own narrative as a therapist, I think it's really important that as therapists, when we hold privileged identities over other people, that at some point it comes up. It is really important for us as professionals to be mindful of the ways that vulnerability can shift from person to person, and in many ways, the ways that identity in and of itself can be a way or a catalyst for someone not being able to be their authentic or true self in the space. If we exist in a system that is constantly telling us that we're not enough, or if, for instance, you are a queer person in a space with a therapist who is about the same age as someone in your life who has been harmful to you, there are these many different factors that can contribute to how you show up in the space. And so we want to be mindful of addressing it, right? So all of the things that I've shared that might make it uncomfortable for you to share something with a therapist are things that are helpful to discuss. Unless, of course, your therapist has harmed you in some way, unless, of course, you have felt like the space has become unsafe for you. So in each of these experiences, we want to be mindful of how can I use the information that I'm learning about myself to share it with the therapist. A lot of the time folks will share like, I'm afraid that my therapist might feel hurt by the information that I want to share. And these are the moments when we want to be mindful of how does confrontation come up for us? What are the things that are keeping us from being able to be vulnerable and do the work with the person who is standing right in front of us? As a person who works with marginalized communities, I find it incredibly important to constantly reassure folks that if something I'm doing is not working, if there is something that feels important to discuss, if I have hurt you in some way by something that I've said, it is really, really important that you feel comfortable enough to tell me. And I am someone who will always bring something up if I felt a way about it. I hope this has been helpful. Being in spaces with therapists and kind of trying to hold space for the ways that identities are different, identities show up, but also the ways that we might struggle to show up as our authentic selves with our therapist is really important. So I hope that you can have grace for yourself in doing this. I hope that you can find the courage to speak up, to tell your therapist if there is something that you are struggling with. Or maybe it might just be to give yourself a little bit of compassion and grace. Take your time in getting to know them, in kind of giving yourself the space to speak up if you need it. If you would like to work with me, my information will be somewhere on the screen. I am on Instagram, TikTok. I was gonna say Facebook, but that's not true. Thank you for being here. And I hope that you stick around. Like, share, subscribe. Bye-bye!